Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're going to be unpacking a landmark Indian divorce case. One that really kind of shook things up in the legal world.
Oh, yeah, this one's a biggie.
Yeah, and it's not just some, celebrity gossip kind of thing. This case really changed the conversation about divorce in India forever.
It really did. It brought this whole concept of irretrievable breakdown of marriage to the forefront of Indian law, something that hadn't really been tackled head on before.
Right, exactly. And that's actually what we're going to be diving into today. The source material in this case is the 2006 Indian Supreme Court judgment in the case of Naveen Kohli versus Neelu Kohli.
A fascinating read, to say the least.
I gotta say, I was hooked. I mean, reading through this judgment, it felt like a thriller, full of these twists and turns, and some pretty intense accusations flying back and forth.
Oh, absolutely. It's a real drama, that's for sure. And it all starts with what seems like a, fairly ordinary marriage. Naveen and Neelu Kohli, they got married back in 1975, had 3 sons, built this successful business together. To the outside world, they looked like, they were living the dream.
Yeah, the picture-perfect family, right?
Exactly. But like we all know, appearances can be deceiving.
Oh, for sure.
By 1994, the marriage, completely fell apart. They separated, and Naveen filed for divorce. And he didn't hold back on the accusation.
Yeah, I was reading through that part. It gets pretty intense.
It does. He claimed Neelu was cruel, not just to him, but to his entire family. And then he even went so far as to allege she had an affair and that she'd been secretly transferring assets into her own name.
Wow. So already we're seeing this isn't your typical, irreconcilable differences kind of divorce. This is getting messy.
Oh, yeah. Buckle up. Because then Naveen drops another bombshell. He starts detailing all these criminal and civil cases that Neelu filed against him. Claims it amounted to years of harassment and mental anguish.
Wow. So not only is he accusing her of, infidelity and financial shenanigans, but she's also hitting him with a barrage of lawsuits.
You got it. And to make matters worse, he brings up this newspaper advertisement where Neelu basically declared him a mere employee of her company, which he argued was a deliberate attempt to damage his reputation.
Ouch. Talk about a public takedown. So, how did Neelu respond to all of this? These are some pretty serious accusations.
Well, unsurprisingly, she denied everything, claimed Naveen's accusations of cruelty and infidelity were completely baseless. In fact, she counter-accused him of having an affair himself. And while she admitted to taking legal action against him, with all those cases, she argued her actions were totally justified.
Okay, so we've got a classic he said, she said situation brewing here. And honestly, it sounds pretty messy. Who do you even believe at this point? What did the initial trial court make of all of this?
So the trial court actually sided with Naveen. They granted him a divorce on the grounds of cruelty.
Cruelty, but, was there any physical abuse or anything like that?
Not necessarily. See, in the context of Indian divorce law, cruelty isn't limited to just physical violence. It encompasses this broader range of behaviors that cause mental or emotional suffering.
Oh, I see. So even without, physical violence, the court's saying a spouse's actions could be considered cruel if they inflict significant emotional distress. That's interesting.
Right. And in this case, the court seemed to buy into Naveen's argument that Neelu's actions, particularly the persistent legal battles and that whole public defamation thing with the newspaper ad, that all met the threshold for cruelty.
Interesting. So I'm guessing Naveen was probably feeling pretty vindicated at this point, right? Divorce granted, case closed, end of story.
Not quite. Remember all those twists and turns I mentioned? Yeah. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. At the high court level, they actually overturned the trial court's decision and dismissed Naveen's divorce petition.
Wait, seriously? What? Why? What was their reasoning for such a drastic reversal?
Well, the high court took issue with Naveen's own alleged infidelity. They labeled his behavior as misconduct and basically gave it more weight than Neelu's actions. They also questioned the validity of some of his claims of cruelty. Essentially, they shifted the focus, suggesting Naveen wasn't quite the innocent victim he portrayed himself to be.
Wow, so this is a huge setback for Naveen, right? What does he do now? Just accept this decision and stay trapped in a marriage that clearly seems pretty broken?
Not if he has anything to say about it.
Yeah.
This unexpected turn of events sent the case all the way up to the highest court in India. the Supreme Court.
Ah, okay. So this is where things get really interesting, right? This is where the Kohli case becomes much bigger than just a personal divorce drama.
You got it. The Supreme Court's involvement, that's what ultimately elevated this case to landmark status.
Okay, I am officially on the edge of my seat. Can't wait to hear what the Supreme Court had to say about all of this. Okay, so just to recap, we've got this couple, right, battling it out in court, each throwing some pretty serious accusations at the other, and then the High Court throws everyone for a loop with their decision. What did the Supreme Court do with this case? I mean, this is the highest court in the land.
Well, yeah, this case had everyone in India talking, and the Supreme Court's decision, I mean, it had massive implications for how divorce is even viewed in India. Right off the bat, the court expressed some serious concerns about the High Court's judgment, especially how they kind of downplayed the whole impact of Neelu's constant legal actions against Naveen.
So basically, the Supreme Court is saying, hold on a second, there's more to this story than just Naveen's alleged affair.
Right. They're acknowledging that Neelu's actions, even if they were technically legal, still played a role in the breakdown of the marriage. It wasn't all one-sided.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this is where things get really interesting, because the Supreme Court goes on to emphasize this concept that, well, it wasn't even a legal ground for divorce in India at the time.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. What concept?
Irretrievable breakdown of marriage.
So they're basically saying the law needs to catch up with reality. Like, sometimes marriages just end, even if there's no clear-cut proof of cruelty or adultery.
Precisely. And that's exactly why the Kohli case became more than just a personal drama. It really sparked this national conversation about how divorce law should reflect the complexities of modern relationships.
Yeah, because things aren't always black and white, right? Relationships are complicated. So what did the Supreme Court ultimately decide in the Kohli case? Did they grant Naveen the divorce, despite the High Court's reversal?
They did. Ultimately, the Supreme Court overturned the High Court's decision and granted Naveen the divorce.
Okay, so he finally gets what he wanted. Case closed.
Well, not so fast. They also increased the permanent maintenance he was ordered to pay Neelu.
Oh, how much were we talking here?
Quite a bit, actually. It went from 5 lakh rupees, which is about 6,000 US dollars, to a substantial 25 lakh rupees. So roughly 30,000 US dollars.
Okay, wow, that's a pretty significant increase. Why such a big jump? Was it just because Naveen was, considered financially well off?
Yeah.
Or was the court trying to make a statement?
I think it was a bit of both. I mean, the court definitely considered Naveen's financial situation, but I think there's a deeper message there too. Increasing the maintenance could be seen as an acknowledgement of the hardship Neelu went through because of her actions.
Ah, I see what you mean. So even though she wasn't granted a divorce, the court seemed to recognize that she also experienced a level of suffering throughout this ordeal.
Exactly. And this highlights a key point about irretrievable breakdown itself. It's not about pointing fingers or declaring a winner and a loser. It's about recognizing that sometimes a marriage just reaches a point of no return,
Yeah.
Regardless of who might be at fault.
It seems like a much more humane and realistic way to approach divorce, right? Focusing on the current state of the relationship instead of getting bogged down in past grievances.
Absolutely. It's about accepting that relationships are fluid, they change over time, and sometimes that leads to their end.
So the Supreme Court made this, landmark ruling urging the government to rethink its stance on irretrievable breakdown as grounds for divorce. Did they, offer any guidelines on how this concept could be implemented in practice?
They did. They specifically referenced a report from the Law Commission of India, which delved into this very issue. It recommended including irretrievable breakdown as a legitimate basis for granting a divorce. And it even suggested some criteria that could be used to determine if a marriage has really reached that point.
What kind of criteria are we talking about here? How do you even measure if a marriage is irretrievably broken?
Well, the report recognized that there's no simple checklist for that.
Right.
You need to really understand the relationship's dynamics to see if there's any chance of reconciliation. However, they did suggest that a period of separation could be one factor to consider.
Okay, that makes sense.
If a couple has been living apart for a certain amount of time, say 2 or 3 years, that could indicate, an irretrievable breakdown.
Yeah, I mean, if two people can't even stand to live together, it's probably a sign that something's fundamentally wrong, right?
Right. But the report stressed that separation alone shouldn't be the deciding factor. The reasons for the separation, any efforts made towards reconciliation, and the overall emotional state of the couple, all that needs to be taken into account.
So it's not as easy as saying, hey, we've been living apart for 2 years, give us a divorce. the court would need to dig deeper into the specifics of the situation.
Exactly. They need to carefully assess whether there's truly no hope for the marriage. And this is important because, well, like with any legal provision, there's always the risk of it being misused.
That's a good point. I can see how some people might be concerned that, making irretrievable breakdown a legal ground for divorce might make it too easy for people to just walk away from a marriage.
Oh, absolutely. There's always that risk that someone might try to use this to their advantage, So any legal framework that incorporates irretrievable breakdown would need some safeguards to prevent frivolous or malicious applications.
Right. Yeah. You don't want people just using this as a quick and easy way out if there's a chance the marriage could be saved.
Exactly.
It's amazing how this one case, the Kohli case, has sparked this, complex debate about divorce law in India. It really touches on some deeply held beliefs about marriage, family, individual rights.
It does. And this isn't just an Indian debate either. The question of whether or not to recognize irretrievable breakdown as a valid reason for divorce, this is something that legal systems around the world are wrestling with.
Oh, that's interesting. So how do other countries handle this? Do they embrace the irretrievable breakdown concept, or do they stick with the more traditional fault-based systems?
Well, that's a whole other deep dive, and it's one we'll be taking in part 3.
So we spent a lot of time on this deep dive really digging into the Kohli case and how it kind of changed things in India. You mentioned other countries have tackled this whole irretrievable breakdown thing as a reason for divorce. What's the story there?
Well, it's a really interesting global conversation. Some countries have totally embraced this idea of irretrievable breakdown and moved away from this system where you have to prove, like, someone did something wrong to end the marriage. But then others, they're still holding on to that traditional model where you got to prove adultery or cruelty or abandonment before you can get a divorce.
Okay, so let's start with the countries that have adopted irretrievable breakdown. What are some examples?
Well, one of the first to really make this shift was Australia. Back in 1975, they completely changed their divorce laws, went from a fault-based system to this no-fault model. So irretrievable breakdown became the only reason you needed for a divorce. And the main way to prove that, well, is by showing that the couple had been living apart for at least 12 months.
So Australia was kind of a pioneer in this, focusing on the reality of the separation instead of making couples dig up all this, painful stuff from the past. Did other countries follow their lead?
Yeah, definitely. Canada, for example, they adopted a no-fault divorce system too, also based on irretrievable breakdown.
It seems like these legal changes are often reflecting, bigger changes in society. As views on marriage change, the law's got to adapt to keep up.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Societies are changing, becoming more individualistic, right? Less focused on these traditional ideas. And legal systems, especially in family law, they got to catch up.
What about Europe? Where do they stand on all this?
A lot of European countries have included irretrievable breakdown in their divorce laws in one way or another. Take England and Wales, for example. Couples can file for divorce and say irretrievable breakdown is the reason. And to back that up, they can show evidence of different things. Could be separation, adultery, or even what they call unreasonable behavior.
So it's not entirely no fault like in Australia. They still have those more traditional grounds for divorce, but they also acknowledge that irretrievable breakdown can cover a lot of different situations.
Right, exactly. They're more flexible, recognizing that relationships end for lots of different reasons. Scotland's similar. Divorce is allowed based on irretrievable breakdown, but there's this required period of separation. But it can be shorter if both people agree.
So there's this growing understanding that a marriage doesn't have to involve some huge betrayal to be over. It could just be, people aren't compatible or the love's faded away.
And that's a really important takeaway here. These irretrievable breakdown laws, they recognize that even without blame or fault, a relationship can just, end.
It's a more compassionate approach, I think, recognizing that people and relationships change. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just allow a separation that's, dignified.
Definitely. But of course, there's always the other side of the argument. Like we talked about before, some people worry that making irretrievable breakdown a reason for divorce could make it too easy, that it might weaken the idea of marriage.
Right. So what about the countries that haven't adopted irretrievable breakdown? What do couples have to go through in those systems?
Well, in systems that are really strict about needing to prove fault, couples often have to go through a much tougher, more emotionally draining process to get divorced. They have to prove their spouse did something wrong, which means they might have to, air all their dirty laundry in public, and relive painful memories.
That just sounds awful. And I bet it makes it even harder to stay civil and maybe, reach some sort of agreement.
Oh, absolutely. It can turn what's already a painful experience into a long and expensive legal battle, adding financial stress on top of everything else. And this focus on who's to blame, well, sometimes it detracts from the real issue, which is the marriage is over and both people just want to move on.
So even if both people agree the marriage is over, they still might have to jump through all these hoops and rehash all this past pain just to get a divorce.
It's true, unfortunately. And if one person doesn't want the divorce, it can drag on forever.
It seems so outdated when you compare it to these more streamlined and humane systems that recognize irretrievable breakdown.
It is a pretty stark contrast. The irretrievable breakdown model, it gives couples a way to end their marriage with respect. It acknowledges that sometimes letting go is the best way to avoid more hurt.
This deep dive has been eye-opening. I mean, we've seen how different countries handle divorce, and it makes you realize that these legal systems are always changing, trying to keep up with society and find better ways to deal with, well, the messiness of human relationships.
Yeah, it really has been fascinating, hasn't it? We started with this court case in India and ended up exploring divorce laws around the world.
We did. And it gives us a lot to think about. We've seen how the law can both shape and be shaped by what society values. And while there's no easy answer to this whole question of how to handle divorce, I think we can all agree that any approach needs to have compassion, fairness, and an understanding that people are complicated.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's been great diving into this with you.
And to everyone listening, we want to hear from you. What do you think? Should irretrievable breakdown of marriage be a reason for divorce everywhere? What are the pros and cons? Share your thoughts on social media using #DeepDiveDivorce. Until next time, keep those brains engaged and keep diving deep.